If you don't mind, I'm going to just go to Genesis chapter 17 for just a moment. I know that this will be we're not going to spend too much time here in Genesis 17, but we spent the last 2 weeks in Genesis 17, and I just wanted to make a couple of final points before we move on, just a couple of interesting things, and then we'll go right on to chapter 18. But I wanted to point out first just this curious and kind of cool little thing that you can see. If you look at Genesis 17, verse 11, which we talked about at great length last time, it says, "And you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin." That word flesh is kind of interesting. And there's some interesting word pictures there. Not as far as like Hebrew word pictures, but the way that this word is used. For example, this is that verse 11 in an interlinear study. And it shows you here, there's the word basar. Flesh is the word basar. Do you notice anything interesting about that word? You ever heard a word that sounds like that?
Gospel, good news.
Yes, the word besorah. You simply just add a hey to the end of that word and it becomes besorah, which is the word gospel. What's interesting is this word basar has this unusual variant that if you look at I had to look at a couple of different concordances. I looked at the Brown Driver Briggs, the one at BibleHub.com. I don't know if you guys use BibleHub. If you go on your laptop or your tablet or your computer, that's one of the really great pieces of software that I like, or web platforms online. They have some good dictionaries and such. I did a little bit of research on this, and there is a strange variant of the word basar where they stick a hey on the end of it, but it is in an unusual place. It is in Numbers 19:5, where it says, "And Eleazar the priest shall take of its blood with his finger and shall sprinkle of its blood directly before the tent of meeting 7 times. And one shall burn the heifer before his eyes, its skin and its flesh." What is this talking about? You guys know?
Is that the red heifer?
That is the red heifer. That is the section of the Torah talking about the red heifer. And that word flesh here is not basar, it's besarah, which is an unusual variant that you would see a hey stuck on the end of the word basar when it's translated as flesh. So I thought that was kind of interesting in light of the fact that the word besarah, which is spelled exactly the same way, is translated as good news. And if you look at Isaiah chapter 52, basar is also someone who is a bearer of these good tidings or whatever. The one who brings mebeser, good news, that brings good news, mebeser. It's used twice in this section right here. So this is that passage that we all know, how beautiful on the mountains are the feet of him who brings or publishes peace, that brings good news and publishes salvation. There's Yeshua, that said to Zion, reigns your God, or your God rules. So what's interesting to me is that this word basar, when translated as a verb, means a herald or one who is bringing something. And if you stick a hay, the spirit, that breath from the hay, stick that on basar, you get gospel. Does that make sense that how the word gospel would be formed from the spirit attaching itself to the flesh? The flesh and the spirit combining? That God would become incarnate and come down to this planet in a fleshly form, spirit and flesh uniting in a perfect form. The word gospel. think that's a fabulous, fabulous word picture that's right there in the Torah. And it's curious to me also that from that previous passage that it has to do with the red heifer, which I think is a very mysterious passage that I think clearly points to the Messiah. So there was just that one little tidbit that I wanted to share with you regarding the Basar. And then one other thing that I wanted to point out that we didn't get a whole bunch of time to talk about, but that is in this section in chapter 17, which talks about the fact that Abraham is not only required to circumcise his physical descendants, but anyone who is a foreigner or a sojourner or who was bought with his money. And I think that right there is in verse 12, you circumcise the male children 8 days old, which we didn't really deal with that, but I think that reminds me of Keith's teaching about Shemini Atzeret on that 8th day, showing about new life and new beginnings. I think that's a great picture there. But I think that this is presaging the bringing in, the grafting in of the Gentiles right here in this passage in verse 12, where it says, who is born in your house or is bought with your money, or any foreigner who is not of your seed. So they must also be circumcised. This is a picture of the Gentiles also being circumcised, but not necessarily physically, as we discussed last time, becoming circumcised in the heart. So that was just a couple of final things that I wanted to bring out regarding chapter 17, just to kind of put a little ribbon on it, point out a couple things that we didn't really have time to discuss last time. Jerry?
Just one more thing to throw in there. In the next book, Exodus, when if they wanted to observe that first Passover, they had to be circumcised. If the stranger wanted to come in and observe it with them, he had to be circumcised.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
that
When the
goes
instructions,
along with this, I think.
yes, when the instructions are given after they have left, Moses reiterates, and well, doesn't reiterate, but iterates, I guess you would say, that this is the regulation for the Passover. And I don't know that there's anything about the Israelites being in Egypt having to be circumcised in order to partake of that Passover, but I do know that Moses institutionalized that commandment after they left, when he was giving them instructions in Exodus 25, saying this is the regulation regarding how you will remember and observe this Passover in future generations. No uncircumcised foreigner is allowed to eat of it. So I think that is a good point, and I think that is probably where the tradition in the Christian church comes from, of them suggesting, here we're going to do communion, and we're going to have everybody hold a cracker and a little cup of juice and examine your heart. That's not really anywhere in the Torah or in the commandments or in the New Testament either, for that matter. But I think that is a tradition that rose up in the Christian church, which to me, to my mind, reflects a little bit of that you must be circumcised in order to partake of the Passover. And I think that's probably where that came from. Now, I have not researched that, but it would make sense to me that some vestige of this idea of a spiritual circumcision having to be present in a person who's going to observe the Passover and partake of it would be what the Christian church has kind of incorporated, in a sense, to say, before don't eat or drink this cup in an unworthy manner, examine your heart before you do this, because you can bring damnation or destruction or, judgment upon yourself. I think that's probably where that came from, but I could be wrong. I'm just throwing that out there. Tracy?
Well, from what I read today in our history about the Roman Catholic Church and instituting the Eucharist and all that, and it seems to be that and baptism were adopted as you have to do these things in order to be saved. So it's kind of like the other side of the circumcision debate.
Sure, absolutely. I think it's a good way to look at it. Yeah, it's just there are traditions in the Christian church just like there are traditions in Judaism. They're just different, but I think that a lot of ways they just picture the same things. They really do. So the meaning has gotten lost.
I was thinking about this. So a male is circumcised.
Yes.
A female is not.
This is physically yes.
Except for in Africa.
What?
Except for in Africa.
Yes, I've heard of that.
Yeah.
So, I sort of think, for a female to be circumcised, it would have to be spiritual.
Yeah.
It seems like somebody would bring up the point where circumcision should have been something else where it could be both female and male, physically.
That's a good
So-
point. That's a good point.
And I wonder
mean,
why that is. Why did God set it for males? Not
well,
for
I think
females?
I think that you make a good observation, and I would only say that it probably has to do with this thing about males and females in general, and the spiritual dichotomy and the relationship between a male and a female. Now, I don't want to go off on that, but I will say that that's probably what it pictures for me. That is a good question, though. Why didn't God...
Because there's no reference, so it has to be your opinion.
Sure, yeah,
There's no
totally.
spiritual reference.
Absolutely, I agree. Angela and then Keith?
I'm guessing maybe something about the man shedding blood for the bride.
Could be. Could be. Keith?
And I didn't know it was such a sensitive subject, but yes, back then the woman was under the covering of the man was circumcised, and he's running the household, so they were covered.
Yeah. That would be my interpretation of that from a spiritual perspective. It's a sensitive subject to me because I have seen how men in the church, unfortunately, have lorded it over their wives and become a bit tyrannical and thought and have arrogated to themselves some type of weird interpretation of this wives be submissive to your husbands, that's just been so misappropriated. So it's a bit of a touchy subject. But I think that's how I would describe it as best I could, Larry, without...
And maybe with the Orthodox, that maybe a woman is unclean to them sometimes. When they're menstruating, they're unclean. That's why they would need 2 restrooms in a dwelling. Because a female cannot use the regular house restroom during that time of the month. I don't know if you knew that or not.
I know that there are people who take those injunctions, very
That
seriously.
stands now, of course.
Sure.
But maybe a female is unclean. One would think until they're over
The hump?
with a male who has been circumcised, till they're married. I don't know.
It's an interesting insight. Yeah. Somebody else? Was there a hand when I wasn't looking? Okay. No, that's a good question, Larry. Thank you. So I am ready to move into chapter 18. Are you?
Go for it.
Let's do it.
Did we thank Tracy for that thing that you sent out on the email?
That correction?
Yeah.
Yeah, what about it?
Did we formally thank her?
Oh, no. Thank you, Tracy.
I thought that was interesting.
No, it was good. It was very good. Yeah, and like I said, I don't even know. Somebody was talking about this, and I know that when I did the research on that, because of course, if I just took Tracy's word for it or whoever Tracy sent, then I wouldn't be doing a good job either. So I took Tracy's information and I did some even more research and discovered, there are some weird, hardcore sects in Judaism which will, not outside the camp necessarily, but like Larry was just talking about, use a separate restroom, and they've got some extremes. There are some cultures in the world, but none of them having to do with Judaism, which will literally put a woman outside of the camp, so to speak.
But not out in the cold.
No.
In a separate building.
In a separate building, in a separate room in the house, if at the very least.
If you look at the history of this country, of our Indian.
Yes, they will. Angela was talking
did
about
that.
that.
When you
And it
see
was
a
not
pickup,
a bad thing.
Sure.
you see it, no, I don't know. When you see a pickup going down the highway and there's an old lady, or not an old lady, but a woman in the back.
They put their women in the back of the
They
pickup
can't ride
truck.
in the front.
They can't ride in the front when they're on their period. Yeah, that's kind of interesting.
And it's
I
not.
think there's a lot of things like that we just have a super duper lack of understanding on, because when it comes to the slaves and how they were kept and all that, if you don't have understanding of scripture and you look at that, you're like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, slavery in the
Yeah.
Bible. It's
Right.
like you have this negative connotation to
Right.
things.
Well, it's because we have these historical anachronisms. We're thinking of black slavery in America and thinking this is what slavery is to us because that's our cultural perspective. But that is not what the Bible is talking about. And there are so many instances of that where we're just interpreting the scriptures through our own cultural lens, and you just can't do that. At the very least, I think when I studied literature in college, that was one of the big things is how do we interpret literature of any kind? And I was always of the opinion that we needed to interpret our literature from the perspective of the person who wrote it. And yes, maybe it's totally valid that you can find interesting points that might reflect something that's happening in your culture now, and you might have valid connections and such, but you really do need to look at it from an historical perspective of what was the author's original intent and what were they talking about. I think that's most important. And so looking at, Alfred Edersheim has some really interesting sketches of Jewish life. There's a book called Sketches of Jewish Life by Alfred Edersheim. That it gives you a lot of historical information that's brought from primary sources into what was life like for Jews in the first century, and you can get a lot of insight from books like that. And understanding the cultural context in which these things were written could go a long way to helping us not have misunderstandings regarding a lot of these things. So thank you, Gracie, for bringing that up. I'm going to go ahead now with Genesis chapter 18, and I will read it, and then we will dissect it as well as we may. So here's what we have. Yehovah appeared to him, Abraham that is, by the plain, or the oak trees, or terebinth trees, you might say, of Mamre, while he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he lifted his eyes and looked and saw 3 men standing opposite him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground and said, what is the first word that he spoke there? What does your translation say, Nathan?
Sorry, I wasn't there.
No, that's okay. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to catch it.
Verses, what verse?
3.
Verse 3?
Yeah.
For the first word?
What is the first word that Abram says?
My Lord.
My Lord. Anybody else have anything different? My translation in the TS 2009, which I really enjoy this translation, they actually put Yod He Vav He. That is not in the text. The text does not say Yod He Vav He.
Sure doesn't say my Lord either.
It says Adonai, which just means Lord.
Well,
Oh,
the Yod at the end is mine,
Yeah.
so it's my Lord.
Yeah, so literally it's translated my Lord, but this translation put Yod He Vav He, which I think that's not appropriate. Anyway, he says, my Lord, if I have now found favor in your eyes, please do not pass your servant by. Please let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. And let me bring a piece of bread, and refresh your hearts, and then go on, for this is why you have come to your servant. And they said, do as you have said. So Abraham ran into the tent to Sarah and said, hurry, make ready 3 measures of fine flour, knead it, and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, gave it to a young man, and he hurried to prepare it. And he took curds and milk and the calf which he had prepared, and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree as they ate. And they said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, behold, in the tent. And he said, I shall certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah, your wife, is to have a son. And Sarah was listening in the tent door which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah was past the way of women. And Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my master being old also? And Yehovah said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I truly have a child, since I am old? Is any matter too hard for Yehovah? At the appointed time, I am going to return to you, according to the time of life, and Sarah is to have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, no, but you did laugh. And the men rose up from there, and looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to send them away. And Yehovah said, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing, since Abraham is certainly going to become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have known him, that he commands his children and his household after him to guard the way of Yehovah, to do righteousness and right ruling, so that Yehovah brings to Abraham what he has spoken to him. And Yehovah said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very heavy, I am going down now to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me, and if not, I know. So the men turned away from there and went toward Sodom, but Yehovah stood still before Abraham. Notice anything weird about that? Let me repeat that.
Yahuwah stood still.
It says Yehovah stood still before Abraham. What does yours say?
Abraham was standing still before Yehovah.
Before the Lord.
They switched it.
Which one is right?
We'll talk about that.
Right?
And Abraham drew near and said, would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the righteous and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it? Far be it from you to act in this way, to slay the righteous with the wrong, so that the righteous would be just as the wrong. Far be it from you. Does not the judge of all the earth do what is right? And Yehovah said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I shall spare all the place for their sakes. And Abraham answered and said, behold, please, I who am but dust and ashes have taken it upon myself to speak to Yehovah. Suppose there are 5 less than the 50 righteous. Would you destroy all of the city for lack of 5? And he said, if I find there 45, I do not destroy it. So God knows how to do math. And he spoke to him yet again and said, suppose there are found 40. And he said, I would not do it for the sake of 40. And he said, let not Yehovah be displeased, and let me speak. Suppose there are found 30. And he said, I would not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, behold, please, I have taken it upon myself to speak to Yehovah. Suppose there are found 20. And he said, I would not destroy it for the sake of 20. And he said, let not Yehovah be displeased, and let me speak only this once. Suppose there are found 10. And he said, I would not destroy it for the sake of 10. Then Yehovah went away as soon as he had ended speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. So there we have 2 very interesting sections. It is a pretty clean break, like 2 very distinct sections of this passage. Him, preparing the meal and talking to Sarah about the child, and she laughing and denying it, and then bam, all of a sudden we're cutting to this discussion regarding Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, I have a couple of questions here. You note that up until now, God has appeared to Abraham or spoken to him, or the word of God came to him on at least a handful of occasions, right? When he was in the land of Haran, God spoke to him. It appeared. That doesn't say it necessarily appeared to him, but he got the word somehow. And then it happened again when he got to Hebron. And then it happened again when he separated from Lot. And it happened again after that when he made the covenant with him. Do you notice something that is different between all of those instances and this instance? What is different?
Face to face.
Yes. The Torah actually tells us that Abraham actually saw something. 3 dudes. He's talking to some type of a physical incarnation, representation, however you want to put it.
And he knew who it was.
And he knew who it was. That's another interesting point. But up until now, it doesn't say, the Torah doesn't tell us that he saw anything, except for that one time in the vision when he saw the flaming furnace and the smoking torch. But that was kind of a symbolic kind of thing. It wasn't God necessarily appearing and speaking or something. So do you have any ideas Or what is your idea or an interpretation of why is it now that suddenly God is appearing in some type of a form? He sees something now. Mike?
I think it has to do with the time that this is taking place in.
That's an interesting insight.
The previous chapter, there's some parallels to the Passover with the bloodshed in a covenant. The fact that they call this time the Moed.
The appointed time. Yeah.
Time of life, is that it?
In chapter 18, the time of life is spring.
Mm-hmm.
And then down below it says, at the appointed time I will return.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got this in chapter 17, them talking about, this happening at the appointed time next year, and then them talking about the appointed time here that the child will be born. And
Yeah.
you've got some references to unleavened bread in the next chapter. This kind of Passover thing taking place in Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah, there's actually, I actually underlined, if you look at the Hebrew word for fine flour, and then you look that up and see where else that is used in the Torah, you can see that that word is almost always used regarding the fine meal offering that is offered on the altar. That would never have leaven in it. That would be unleavened cakes of some kind. You wonder, when was there ever leavened bread offered on the altar?
Good question.
That is a good question, and I'm not telling you that I have the answer, but I believe that there is, during the Feast of Shavuot, leavened bread that is used, but they are waved before Yovah. They are not put on the altar. So I would have to double check that. So I'm not going to say anything definitive, but I do know that when this word fine flour is used, he's making cakes of fine flour. It basically says kind of like discs. Those cakes, that word for cakes there in Hebrew is kind of like, you might have seen on like National Geographic or something, they still make bread in this way where they've got like a wok that is turned upside down that has some holes in it to allow the fire they just put it right over the fire, and then you just make these flat cakes, dough out of flour and water. Yeah, and they just flap it right over that domed pot, and it makes a thin, like a tortilla that's been freshly made. And frankly, I know that the tortillas that we get probably have some type of leavening agent in them, but not in this case, where it's fine flour just mixed with water and turned into little cakes. Discs is what the Hebrew translation is, could be literally translated as discs. So I think that's another indication, Mike, that she's making unleavened bread here herself. I think so.
There's also a foot washing taking place.
There's a foot washing. That's also very curious, because that reminds you of the Lord's Supper or the Passover that Yeshua had with with his disciples, if you want to look at it that way. So go ahead, Jerry.
Isn't this the first time since the flood that God has actually come down and intervened and said, hey, enough is enough?
Yeah.
It's judgment time.
Yeah.
Then also when, I think up in Capernaum, when Christ was walking the earth, he told those people, if the people in Sodom and Gomorrah had seen what you're seeing today, they would have repented on the spot.
Right.
I don't know if that ties in with this at all.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Might.
Yeah. Do we see? You might actually kind of have to jump forward to the next chapter, but you can also see some striking parallels to the Passover in that section as well. What do you say about that, Mike?
I think Revelation kind of ties it together with the city that's known spiritually as Sodom in Egypt, where the Lord was crucified.
Right.
Although they're talking about place, I think they're talking about time.
Sure.
Because you have the Lord being crucified at Passover, you have the Exodus happening at Passover,
Right.
and then Sodom and Gomorrah happening at
Right.
Passover.
Right. Yeah, I think there's some pretty clear indications in chapter 19, and we can, it's not a huge part of the section that we would talk about perhaps next week if we make it to chapter 19, which I hope we will. But I think, Lot offers the angels unleavened bread. It's kind of an interesting thing. The whole scenario of God's judgment is coming down. He brings them into the house, yeah. the whole scenario where God's judgment is coming down in destruction and death, and somebody is rescued and makes it out of this situation. It's a real kind of a replay of Passover, in a way. And so I think there's every reason to believe that this is happening at a Passover, and that sometime in the next year, and he says, I will return to you next year at the appointed time, in the time of life, the spring, and Sarah will have a son. So I think it's very likely that Isaac was born during the Passover, or at least close to it. But I think there is an indication that that's happening. So Mike has suggested that it is perhaps one of the reasons that God has become visible in this instance. Any other ideas regarding why that might be? What have we noticed? I think we talked about this at least once or maybe twice before, about how God in Abraham's life becomes silent and then becomes vocal again, and becomes silent and becomes vocal again. And we noticed some circumstances that might be attributable to that. Does anybody remember that? You remember that when he first entered the land, he was following the instructions, and he went to Shechem, and he lodged there, and he pitched his tent between Bethel and Ai, and God appeared to him, and he built an altar, and then he started heading south.
Is that when he lied to the king?
That was part of it. He began to be, I think that we noted, and I made the argument. Mike had a slightly different take on it, but we kind of went back and forth on this a couple of chapters ago, that the further south he went, things changed. God didn't appear to him anymore. Then we had the whole episode with Egypt, and things went all haywire. Then he comes back to the land. He separates from Lot, and then God appeared to him again. Now, God appears to him in this physical manifestation. Notice also that Lot is tangentially involved again, and that something has just taken place, which is, remember that he separated from Lot and was in the place he was supposed to be when God began to speak to him again. And now we've just had another bit of separation, haven't we?
He's circumcised.
He became circumcised. I think that there is a possibility that this spiritual insight regarding circumcision has to do with why God appeared to him in a physical, strong manifestation. That's just the way I'm looking at it.
Because he has been circumcised?
Because he has been circumcised. Now, of course, you can look at it physically, but I think it's a picture of the spiritual aspects of circumcision. It's not because he literally circumcised himself, but it also is that. But it's also, I think, that the spiritual implication is not lost on Abraham. And I think that because of his willingness to follow those commands, those instructions that he receives from God, he is warranted in receiving a more glorious, straightforward, face-to-face revelation. And that there's a picture there for us that I'll give you an illustration. I heard this rabbi talking this week. It was Rabbi David Aaron. And he was talking about how you are like a radio. And that and you've heard this before probably, about how you're supposed to channel God. You're supposed to be a conduit through which God's love and his grace and his caring and his word are to go forth into the world. And he kind of likened it to human beings wanting to get in tune with God and be a radio which is not putting out static or wavering in and out of intelligibility. You kind of losing the speech or the artist or the singer, whoever's on the radio. The way you tune your radio is by keeping the instructions of God. That you become a better conduit and a better transfer of God's attributes into this world when you attune yourself through keeping his instructions. Jerry?
What you're saying is you want to go from AM to FM.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to look at it.
I was just thinking too, looking back at the circumcision, he took this physical route of removing the flesh, which defiles, right?
Right.
So that this pure seed could produce fruit,
Right.
which they're being told Isaac is going to be born.
Yes.
And there's this picture of Abraham as the father and Isaac as the Messiah.
Sure.
So there's this messianic picture here that's also kind of overlapping this Passover time frame.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
you know, when the Messiah came in the flesh,
Mhm.
now we've got this picture of God coming
Yeah.
in the flesh to...
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that as we continue on with the Torah, the if I want to look at it this way, the pictures that you see of the Messiah in the Torah keep getting stronger. You can see the Messiah in Isaac. It's strong in certain instances, but by the time you get to, you know, the end of this book of Genesis, and we're dealing with Joseph, there's a strong picture of the Messiah. And then it just keeps going, you know. So I think that we are seeing the germination, the seed, the germinating seed of the Messiah in Isaac. I think that's absolutely true.
And I think the other tie to Passover here is that if he's being born at Passover, the picture we see later of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, that's a clear picture of the Passover.
Yeah.
Right? There's
Yeah.
a lot of Passover symbolism in that
Sure.
chapter.
Absolutely. Absolutely agreed. Yeah, you are absolutely right. So I think, you know, the spiritual wisdom for us should perhaps be, if we want to hear from God in a more clear way, we need to remove the obstacles. Because remember in our study from last week that foreskin is a blockage, that orla, that ereb, you know, or erel, excuse me, is a blockage, something that's in the way. And I think that as we get the flesh out of the way, get those things in our lives out of the way that should not be there, we can hear from God in a more clear manner. I think that's the lesson that I would like to impart to you regarding this section, is that God appeared to Abraham in a strong fashion when he was willing to get the flesh out of the way. So if you want to hear from God in a strong fashion and begin to commune with God more carefully and more clearly, let's get the flesh out of the way. Fleshliness needs to be removed. Sorry, Tracy.
I just, before we go past this section, and it's just a cool little insight, is I think there's a relation to Sarah preparing 3 measures of fine meal and the parable of the leaven that Messiah tells. And I'm not exactly sure, because I have a couple of ideas about it, but that's what he says, the kingdom of heaven is like
a woman who put leaven into a lump and it leavened.
To 3 measures of meal.
Yeah, okay.
And this is the other place in Scripture that talks about specifically 3 measures of meal.
Right.
Until all was leavened.
Yeah.
Which is a picture of the kingdom of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something here, I just know that and I think Israel and Sarah both have similar names, with the letters in their names.
Right, right.
And the meanings. And so I think there's a picture there, because the woman Messiah is speaking about is Israel. And hiding the doctrine, the good word in the meal until the whole world is leavened, kind of thing.
Yeah.
3 measures, I think about Joseph's dream was 3,000 years maybe, or something.
Yeah.
But here, clearly it's about these 3 men that she's giving them to. Could it be a representation of the Father, Son, Spirit?
Many have interpreted it that way, and that's one thing that I hadn't made a lot of notes to myself in regards to that. I did, hear some ideas spoken by other commentators on this passage, saying, that there's a lot of confusion about this because of the way Abraham addresses them. Sometimes they're called men, sometimes they're called angels, sometimes they're called God. Sometimes they're addressed in the singular, sometimes in the plural. Sometimes in the second person, sometimes in the first, sometimes in the third. It's really
reminiscent of, how we view the Messiah and the
Right.
Spirit of the Father and all of that.
right.
And also, Messiah says, go out and teach, make disciples, and teach them to observe all things that I've commanded you, baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and
Right.
the Holy Spirit.
Right.
I think this picture of leaven and bread, leaven being doctrine, whether good or bad, it will leaven the lump.
Sure. Sure.
So
It's a good.
there's got to be some.
I'm sure that there's something there, and I think maybe if we look at I would connect it back with this idea regarding the basar, with the flesh and the spirit being added, and the gospel, and this circumcision even. I mean, to take it all together, I think that there's probably something there. It's probably hidden a little bit, but yeah, you're right. I'm sure that you're right, that there's something hidden there. It would take some digging, but we could find it, I'm sure. I think that if you look at this God being revealed in the form of three men, it's clear to us from the way that Abraham responds. When he sees them, he runs from the tent door and, is immediately ready to bring them in, not bring them in, I don't mean bring them into his home necessarily, but entertain, show his hospitality, make him, wash their feet, provide them with food. And I think that when we look at that, we can sometimes get this confusing picture of, what is this? Is this God in the flesh and he just doesn't recognize? Is it an angel? Is it, who knows? I think in relation to what I was just talking about a moment ago with Rabbi David Aaron talking about how, when we align ourselves with God's instructions and remove the flesh out of the way and we become more finely attuned to God, that we become a better conduit. There's a good picture here perhaps about how these angels or messengers of some kind can be referenced as God. And I heard both Rabbi Aaron and Grant Luton kind of, we talked about this. Grant gave a cute little illustration and said, if I'm sitting here and I'm talking to Gracie, and Jerry couldn't be here tonight, and I'm talking to Gracie on the phone, and I'm saying, oh, hi, Gracie, it's good to talk to you, love you, yeah, I hope you guys are doing great. And some alien is watching me through the window talk to this phone and call it Gracie. You might come away with the interpretation that this is Gracie. But what is this? It's a conduit through which Grace is talking to me. This is not literally Gracie, but in a sense, literally it is, because her voice is speaking clearly to me through this device. And I think that might be one way to look at how angels operate, that they are so finely in tuned with God, they are an extension of Him. It's just like, hey, I'm sending you down there and you're going to be a mouthpiece. He might literally speak through them. And they would empty themselves to the point where he, not taking over their bodies or something, but he is indwelling them in a strong sense and is speaking right through them. And therefore, the writer, Moses, would let us know there's no difference. This is the angel of the Lord. This is an angel. This is God. However you want to look at it, doesn't matter. They're one and the same thing. Two different things, but the same thing. Now, how does that relate to the Messiah? Probably in the same way, but in a deeper sense. I know there were a couple of hands up. Jerry?
Just got a thought now. When Abraham bowed down to these three, and that would seem like he was worshiping them.
It's always an act of worship that I'm aware of,
They did
yeah.
not rebuke him and say, worship God only. Whereas
Sure.
John in Revelation, when he bowed down to the angel, and he said, get up, man. You don't worship me, you worship God.
Right.
So if it hadn't been God, they would have rebuked him, I would think.
Yeah,
Said
I
something to
mean,
him.
yeah, you see a couple of examples where the angel, a messenger, does say, don't worship me. I'm just a dude. I think that's the only one that I'm aware of, actually.
The one in Revelation.
In Revelation.
The only place I can think of right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's an interesting insight, yeah. And Messiah, people will bow down and worship the Messiah. And he certainly doesn't.
Yeah, he accepted
He
it.
doesn't rebuke anybody for that. Hey, Tracy?
I think it's also there's scripture in Hebrews. This could be a teaching about brotherly love too, because he says, let brotherly love continue, be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware.
Yes. Yeah. Now that's an interesting thing, and I know that now I would like to connect that to this passage, and I think you certainly could, although Abraham certainly seems to have been aware. He wasn't entertaining angels without knowing it. or maybe in a sense he was. I mean, maybe he thinks he's entertaining God.
Well, this word can also mean secretively.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a secretive type of
Sure.
communication.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good insight. Good insight. And I think when we look at the way that Abraham responds to it, carrying off that same message that you were just speaking about, Tracy, regarding, let brotherly love continue, and some have entertained angels unwittingly or unknowingly or in secret, that we can take from Abraham some good lessons just regarding what he does when he perceives these men approaching. What does he do? The first thing he does is he runs. Okay? He doesn't walk. He doesn't dilly-dally. He doesn't, drag his heels. He runs
Well,
to
this sounds like the parable of the prodigal son, too.
It does, doesn't it?
I'm wondering how that might be related to it.
Yeah, there's so many amazing connections here. But I think for us, we can look at the example of how Abraham conducted himself in showing hospitality to strangers. Let's just put it that way to make it a broader category. To say Abraham ran to humble himself and to be of service. He ran and bowed himself to the earth. So there's a first indication that he is not only humble and willing to serve, but he is alacritous. He's serving with alacrity, with a cheerful heart, and doing it immediately. He is under-promising and over-delivering. You notice that? I'm going to, maybe wash your feet and I'll bring you a piece of bread. But he lays out a spread, man. I mean, he's got meat. How long? That's another thing that just occurred to me. How long did this take?
24 hours.
This had to have taken a good long time. I mean, you guys have seen me roast a leg of lamb in my backyard. That takes 4 hours just to roast the leg. So we've got Sarah, if somebody's churning some butter and making some cheese or some curds of some kind, we got a dude who's slaughtering a young calf. That's just going to take a little while. We got to prepare the meat. We got to get the fire going. We got to roast this whole thing. I'm sure they didn't eat it raw. So he's got, sounds like an all-day process. These guys were kicking it under this tree for at least the remainder of the afternoon. They were there for a good long time.
I want to know the rest of what was said. There must have been a lot more conversation.
There must have been quite a conversation. They must have been there for hours. But Moses tells us what God wants him to tell us, which is the most important thing, whatever that might be. And I'm thinking that, we learn from this that we should serve others with alacrity, with a cheerful heart, with humility. We under-promise and over-deliver. We make good on what we say we're going to do. I think we can take all of those lessons from this little section here. I think there's just, a couple of small things that you might have noticed that I thought was kind of funny is that he's serving meat and cheese together, and to God himself no less. So the Jewish Orthodox idea of not having cheeseburgers, I think, is kind of thrown out the window in this passage. That would just be my opinion, yes.
No, I think it's popular opinion they were on separate plates.
Well, it's not what it says in the Torah anyway. It says you don't cook the kid in the mother's milk. It doesn't say you don't have milk in.
Well, that's how they've interpreted it, though.
Yeah, they do now.
Yeah. So, but I think that if they had, well, of course they've looked at this passage, but that they will say, no, he fed them the dairy products, and they ate that, and then that was while the calf was cooking, and then several hours later, they ate the calf. That's not what it says. It says he placed before them all of the items together. So I just thought that was kind of funny.
That was 400 years before the law came, though.
Yeah.
I'm not going to have something to do with it.
Right. Yeah. What is that, Nathan? What are you grumbling about?
Well, no. I mean, we just see plenty of examples of understanding of the law, and Abraham's called righteous. I mean, I guess it does say by his faith, but it says he teaches my commandments. I think it says just a few verses later, he teaches his people my commandments.
Seems to be a conditional statement, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You noticed about that when God spoke to him, seeing as I know that Abraham teaches his children so that I might fulfill for him what I have promised? You notice that? Mm-hmm. It's exactly what Yeshua said. It's exactly what Paul and Peter and James said. They're all saying the same thing.
I just think today's Jewish understanding of that whole milk and
It's a little silly,
meat
yeah.
product is I think it's silly. I mean, they're adding flourish to it. It says specifically you don't boil a kid in the mother's milk. It doesn't even say you don't boil a kid in goat's milk. It says in the mother's milk.
Right.
So it's just
Yeah, it's a little weird.
too much.
Angela?
You want to give the other.
Do you have an interpretation of that passage?
No, do you?
No, I do. I'm asking Nathan. I mean,
Which
what is your
one?
regarding the kid and the mother's milk?
Well, I mean, I view it as very practically speaking. I assume-
Literally not cook
Well,
meat in
of
the
course.
milk of the...
Of course, yeah. I view it as a very practical thing. I imagine there's something incorrect, genetically speaking, with cooking meat in the same milk of its mother.
Taking a young
think
animal
you might
and
get sick,
literally
yeah.
cooking it in the milk of its mother.
Yeah, I mean, I view it as a very, very practical health code type thing, yeah.
Okay, all right. I mean, yeah, that could be. I have, I mean, yeah, you could literally take it literal and
Do you have a
say,
different idea?
I do.
I do have a different idea.
Let's hear what Jerry has.
Well, I have read that it had to do with that's what the pagans were doing in their worship.
So you're taking
The way
it
that they
literally
worship,
as
so
well.
because they did it, the Hebrews didn't do it.
Okay.
No,
So-
no, that's just.
No, I understand. So that, yeah, that, I mean, that if you're taking it literally, and Nathan has an idea that it's literal, and you have an idea that it's literal, and that you have assigned a reason to it, that pagans would cook,
Yeah.
young calves in the milk of their mother or something, and that certainly could be true. I don't know. I don't have any evidence that that's true. I think there's a much simpler explanation.
Can I?
You can, please.
Because I've said this. Don't take mama's baby away and kill it for food before it's weaned. If it's still in her milk. If it's still eating milk from its mother, it's too young to. And I saw a video of a cow who got separated from its baby. And cows freak out when you take their babies away.
Yes, they
I
do.
mean, they freak out. This
You
poor
don't
cow.
wanna be between-
I saw the same video. It was absolutely, it was heart-wrenching to see
I
a,
think it means don't take it before it's weaned.
yeah,
All the parts with it that she's letting it go to be a certain age, letting it go.
Not only does she have there's some kind of instinct thing
Right.
going in there because they rescued this cow and didn't know it even had a baby. And so this mother is at this rescue place and this mother just screamed all night long.
and she had
They-
milk just
"What's
dripping
going on
from her
here?"
udders.
They found the baby, brought it to her, and she's like trying to get between the bars. When she sees it, she's trying to squeeze herself in between the fence. And the baby fainted twice on the way to her. It was just
It was heart-wrenching. But I think that's an excellent illustration, and I think that is probably, and there are rabbis who interpret the passage in that way. Not all rabbis say, oh, that's a prohibition against eating dairy and meat together. And some have said, yeah, you shouldn't do that literally, but there are others who say this is just a simple commandment that says, do not take the child of an animal that is still nursing. That's just not right. And I think that that one makes the most sense to me from especially when God has a commandment that talks about the eggs and the mother. You can take the mother, you can't take the young, but don't take the mother. So he has compassion for, and that is referenced as the smallest commandment in the Torah, the least of these commandments, if you will, is regarding taking of a mother and the nestlings in the nest. So I mean, if he's concerned about nestlings with the mother and the baby chicks in the nest, he's going to be concerned about you taking a calf that is not even weaned from its mother. So I think that is. You notice also that in most of the Torah, when it talks about animals that are ready to be sacrificed, how old are they? A year old. Now, you can look at the commentaries from the rabbis about that. It is not prior to a year. It is they have reached 1 year, which means they would no longer be in their mother's milk. So I think that that's a good takeaway from that section. Anybody else have any other comments or questions about that section? Okay.
How could it go from, so how did it go from actually what the scripture said to somebody believing that they should not have meat and dairy in the same meal? That was all just conjecture and handed down. Base interpretation.
You create buffers around the law to not even get close. That's the way I view it. The Jews take the law and they have all these rules. Like for instance, on like the Sabbath, Jews don't use their cell phone.
Turn on the lights.
Or they don't turn on the lights. They've got all these rules to keep them from even getting close.
And
Well, that's creative.
that's creative thinking, and I think that there is some legitimacy in building a fence around the Torah to a degree. Not to have those things replace the commandments, but it's like, your toddler, you teach him not to touch the burner on the stove, right? Well, no, you teach him to stay away from the stove, period. That's building a fence around the instruction, right? The instruction is that little burner on top of the stove will burn you. But we don't teach them, don't touch the burner. We tell them, stay away from the stove, period. Don't even get close to it. So we've built a fence around that instruction. And I think to a certain degree that's okay. But they might get the wrong idea, and that can create the problem where they accidentally touch the stove one day and say, I didn't get burned. Well, you can see how that's going to play out.
If they're old enough to make that reasoning, they're old enough to understand. But I said don't touch it.
Right.
Some places are hot and you get burned.
Right. And I think that it would be best if we were to say, with clear intent, this is the part that gets hot and will burn you. When this part is open, it will also burn you. For your own protection, I'm advising you to stay away from the whole thing to the extent that they can understand that. So why would people interpret this thing as, don't eat dairy and meat together? That doesn't seem like building a fence around the Torah to me when there's a much clearer, plainer definition. What's that?
I think they're just overthinking it.
It could be that you're just overthinking it.
Which is a
Let's
big-
try to comprehend God's spiritual word.
True.
But
Keith?
the word of it, don't boil a kid, and it's, why did he have to use boil? Don't take a goat, don't kill a goat, but they had to use the word boil. You see what I'm saying? So that's why is it the word boil? Huh?
It could be a Hebrew idiom. I don't know. That's
Maybe
a
it
good.
means literally don't boil the kid.
And you know what? Frankly, Nathan, I think you're
Like
fine.
literally
with that.
don't
Yes.
eat pork.
If you're fine,
literally
you know
keep
what?
salmon.
I am
Right.
totally fine with that. That you will not ever catch me literally boiling a young animal in the milk of its mother.
You
I
guys
would
are all
not
just
do that under any.
figuratively eating pork.
Don't figuratively eat pork. No, you're absolutely right. That's a good insight.
But our concept on the turning on the light switch and using a cell phone is that we don't want to do anything. Our Creator is Elohim, and therefore we should not mimic Him and create anything of our own on the Sabbath.
Sure.
Well, there are examples in.
Correct.
Yeah, but yeah.
You know that.
Yeah. There are examples in the
So,
Gospels. that
not
they
to
do
cook.
that. Yeah.
Creating a fire, cooking.
Yeah.
That's even in the Torah. They're not cooking that day.
Well, no, that's
Is it?
not.
It's not really?
You shall not
That's part of
kindle a
creating.
flame. You shall not kindle a flame.
You can use your microwave.
Oh, but You have to-
Okay, let me ask you a question, and I don't want to get bogged
have to have
down on
flame
this.
cook.
Hold on here.
You're bogged.
Let's not get bogged down on this. I want to throw out one thing. Have you ever, any of you, tried to light a fire with a flint and steel?
With what?
A flint and steel.
Flint
yes.
and steel, not a lighter, not
Yeah.
matches.
Yeah.
Talking, have you kindled a flame, either with a bow drill or with a flint and steel?
magnifying glass.
No, that's cheating.
During the day.
So it's labor.
I'm talking about in a primitive way
is
with
labor.
labor. Have you ever done it?
Yes.
How long did it take you, Nathan?
It's not easy at all.
It is not easy at all.
Yeah.
It is challenging. That is work, and quite a bit of it. You will wear yourself out. I have actually trained my children to light a fire with flint and steel, and we will be out there for hours. Frustration, tears, weeping, gnashing of
You're
teeth.
not very nice.
No, I am. I'm very patient and
I
very
didn't say
nice.
you weren't patient. I said you're not very nice.
Yes,
But
I've
no,
spent some
I didn't
nights
make them stay out there. I stayed out there myself, and they would come and go. But you know what? It's hard work lighting a fire. And so I think that it's basically a commandment that says, look, don't kindle a flame on the Shabbat. You should prepare for that in advance. You notice how everything is a preparation on the 6th day, you get everything ready. I think it'd be a good idea to keep some coals buried,
Preparation, start the fire that day.
That's right. Start the fire that day, keep it burning through the night, keep some coals going.
Yeah, but I've got some friends that won't use a can opener to open a can of tuna fish and mix it up and make a sandwich.
Yes, and you
I'm
can
like,
go
well, God
overboard
bless
and
you if that's
decide
what you
I'm not
feel you
gonna,
want.
I'm not gonna, because when you flip a switch on your wall, there's a little spark in there, so you're kindling a fire. Well, okay, true enough. But do we really need to go that far? And I think that's the last thing I will say about that. Does anyone want to continue beating this a dead horse?
I will say about the fences.
You what?
Making a fence around the Torah.
Okay, yes, please.
I think we find in Jesus, I think Jesus specifically calls them out for creating that fence. He teaches doctrines of God, the commandments of men. And
Yes.
I think he goes out of his way to poke at their rules. So they had the rule of not lifting anything heavier than a fig. And when he heals the guy, he tells him to lift his mat, thus breaking their law, which was a fence. Which wasn't like, oh, we're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. What does it really mean to work? Let's define work as lifting something heavier than a fig. So if it's a twig, that's not work. If it's a mat.
Okay, so I will grant you that, and I will agree. Now I will ask you the question: why did he do that? Mike.
Mikey.
No, I was just going to say, I think that it's when you are placing those laws above the Torah and inflicting that on others. I think at an individual level, there's nothing wrong with putting a fence around a fence if you struggle with something. If you're an alcoholic, you might say, I'm not going to go into a bar, whereas I can go into a bar and not get drunk because I don't want to drink, right? So
Good way to look at
an
it.
individual level, I don't think there's anything wrong with placing certain boundaries to keep from breaking the Torah.
Great insight.
For your own conviction.
Yes, if afflicting others with heavy burdens, that's a great insight. But Keith, you did raise your hand.
Yeah, adding to or taking away from his original commandments. It's that simple. But at the same time, these men who were entrusted to help keep the general population in check, that's what they thought they were doing, right? Because
The first few minutes.
they were in charge.
Well, you've heard some of our founders say that if men will not rule themselves by the Bible, they will be ruled by the sword. And I mean, you've heard any pastor you've ever seen in a Christian church will get to flogging his sheep, for being bad sheep. And that's just what the leaders of God's people do, because they get frustrated in the sickness in the sheep and seeing the sheep misbehave and not doing the instructions, and you get frustrated and you start doing stupid stuff.
Try to be the Holy Spirit.
Trying to be the Holy
They
Spirit.
beat their plowshare into a sword.
They beat their plowshare into a whip. I think that, frankly. So I mean, if the leader, the rabbi, the elder, the teacher, the preacher, the pastor, whatever, if his primary responsibility is to do what Yeshua told Peter to do, feed my sheep. He didn't say beat my sheep. He didn't say corral my sheep.
Share my sheep.
He said, he didn't say shear my sheep. He said, feed my sheep. That, I think, is a big problem, is that the shepherd, what is the shepherd's job? Well, yeah, sometimes it is to shear the sheep, but when he gave the instruction to Peter and what he wants for us to, anybody who's like a leader or trying to teach people or something, feed those sheep. A sheep that is healthy and is being fed will breed and propagate just fine. But if you've got sick sheep because they're starving and their pastor or their shepherd has not fed them, then you'll have sick sheep on your hands, and they will not be able to reproduce. So I think there's a good metaphor there that we if we are trying to shepherd someone, feed them. Literally, physically, metaphorically, any way you want to look at it, feed those sheep. thank you for that delightful discussion. That was good. I have a couple more notes. What time is it here? Am I running late on time? I probably am.
About 8:40.
Yeah. Okay. I'll tell you what. We'll go ahead and pause here. Yeah. We'll